The stagecoach driver didn't even slow down. He threw Mara Ellsworth's bag from the moving coach like a man tossing garbage into a ditch, and the leather satchel burst open when it hit the frozen Wyoming roads, her spare dress tearing across the mud, her late husband's pocket watch skidding into a ditch, her dead son's small wooden toy horse shattering against a stone. Most of its windows were dark. The two men inside the coach laughed. One of them leaned out the window and called back something that made the other laugh harder. Mara stood in the road and watched the coach disappear around the bend, and she did not cry. She had learned long ago that crying cost energy she could not spare. She picked up every piece: the watch, the shattered toy, the ruined dress. She packed them back into the broken bag and held the whole thing closed with both hands, because the latch was gone now too, and she walked the remaining 2 miles into Red Hollow, Wyoming, alone in the cold in October, wearing the only dress she had left, which was torn at the shoulder and stained with road mud and dried blood from the cut above her cheekbone, where one of the thieves had backhanded her for reaching toward her bag too slowly. She had traveled 600 miles to marry a man she had never met. She arrived looking like something the frontier had chewed up and spat out, and she was absolutely certain, with the particular certainty that comes from a life that has handed you too many losses, that the moment Gideon Voss laid eyes on her, he was going to put her right back on the next stage east. If you were standing in Mara Ellsworth's shoes that October morning, broke, bruised, carrying a bag held together with nothing but your own 2 hands, walking toward a stranger who had agreed to marry a version of you that no longer existed, what would you do? Would you keep walking, or would you sit down in the road and finally let yourself break? This is the story of a woman who kept walking. And what she found when she got there changed everything for her, for a grieving rancher and for a little girl who recognized grief before she could even name it. If stories like this one speak to something in you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Mara's journey all the way to the end. Hit the like button and leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Red Hollow in October was the color of an old bruised brown and gray, and the faded gold of dying grass pressed flat under a sky the color of pewter. It was not a welcoming place. It had never tried to be. The town existed because cattle needed a place to come through and men needed a place to drink after driving them, and that was about the full measure of its ambition. Mara walked down the main street, holding her broken bag closed and keeping her eyes straight ahead, because she had learned on the road that looking uncertain invited the wrong kind of attention. She had a name and an address written on a folded paper in her coat pocket. She had $4.30, which was everything left after the robbery. She had a bruise across her left cheek that had gone from red to purple overnight and was beginning to turn the yellow-green of a healing wound that wasn't finished hurting yet. She found the post office because it was the only building with a sign she could read from 50 yards. The postmaster was a small, neat man named Burrell who looked at her face and then deliberately did not look at her face, which she appreciated more than she could have said. Gideon Voss, she told him. I'm looking for Gideon Voss. He's expecting me. Burrell studied her for a moment with the careful eyes of a man who has seen a lot of things come through a post office and learned to keep his opinions about most of them to himself. He's likely at the feed store, Burrell said. Or he was 20 minutes ago. You want me to send word? No, Mara said. I'll find him. She found him outside the feed store, loading grain sacks into the back of a wagon with the focused, economical movements of a man who did physical work every day and had long since stopped thinking about it. The Carl twin shoes. He was taller than she'd expected him, the letters run through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same Wyoming limestone as everything else out here. He was not smiling, but he did not look unkind. He looked like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to smile reflexively. The way some people do after loss takes up permanent residence in their chest. She knew that look. She wore it herself. Beside him stood his daughter. Mara had known from the letters that there was a daughter, 7 years old, name of Tessa. The child who needed a mother's care, which was the practical foundation of the arrangement. She had pictured a generic child, small, probably shy, probably cautious around strangers. Most of its windows were dark. She had not pictured this particular 7-year-old who was standing next to her father's wagon wearing a dress that someone had mended with different colored thread and watching from the street with eyes that were far too old for her face. Tessa saw Mara first. Children noticed things adults had learned to overlook, and what Tessa noticed was not the bruise or the torn dress or the battered bag. What she noticed was the way Mara walked, not defeated, exactly, but careful, measured. The walk of someone who had learned to carry weight without letting it show, which is its own kind of language, and Tessa was fluent in it. Mara stopped a few feet from the wagon. "Mr. Voss," she said. Gideon turned. His eyes went to her face, to the bruise, to the dress, to the bag, and she watched him register all of it in the span of about 2 seconds. She had practiced what she was going to say on the walk from the post office. She had the words ready. "I'm Mara Ellsworth," she said. "I need to tell you straight off that I know this isn't what you were expecting. The stage was robbed 2 days outside of Laramie. I lost everything except what I'm carrying, which isn't much. I understand if this changes the arrangement. I can wait at the post office for the next eastbound stage if you'd rather." She kept her voice steady. She was proud of that. She had gotten very good at keeping her voice steady when everything inside her was not. Gideon Voss looked at her for a long moment. Not the way men sometimes looked at her, measuring and dismissive, but the way a person looks when they're trying to understand something that isn't immediately clear. He opened his mouth to say something, and Mara braced herself, because she had already decided that if he was decent about it, she would not cry, and if he was not decent about it, she would not cry either. She would simply leave. And then Tessa forced the wagon. The child moved with the deliberate purpose of someone who has made a decision and intends to act on it before the adults can complicate things, which is a very particular kind of courage. She walked straight to Mara, looked up at her, and took hold of Mara's free hand with both of hers. Mara looked down. She couldn't help it. Tessa was studying her face with those 2 old eyes, not staring at the bruise the way adults tried not to, just looking at Mara, like she was trying to find something specific and had just located it. "Does it hurt?" Tessa asked. Her voice was small and careful. Mara's carefully maintained composure did something complicated in her chest. "Not much anymore," she said. Tessa considered this. Then she said with the simple directness that children deploy before adults teach them that wanting things out loud is dangerous. "Can you come home with us?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing Mara had heard in 600 miles of travel. She looked up at Gideon Voss. He was watching his daughter with an expression Mara could not entirely read, something between helplessness and the particular ache of a father who would do almost anything to put light back in his child's eyes and has run out of ideas about how. "Tessa," he said. "She looks tired, Papa," Tessa said, without letting go of Mara's hand. "And her bag is broken." Gideon Voss looked at Mara. Mara looked back at him. They were 2 people who had each been cracked apart by loss and reassembled into something functional but not quite whole, standing on a dirt street in a cold Wyoming town, and a 7-year-old was making their decisions for them. "My daughter," Gideon said quietly, "does not beat around the bush." "No," Mara agreed. "She doesn't." He reached out and took the broken bag from Mara's hands. Not roughly, not with any great ceremony. Just took it because it needed carrying, and she'd been carrying it far enough. "We can talk about the arrangement later," he said. "You look like you haven't slept in 2 days. 3, Mara said. Something moved across his face. He nodded once. 3, he said, and loaded her bag into the wagon. Blackthorn Ranch was 7 miles from Red Hollow, which felt longer in an October wind that had opinions about where it was going and didn't care much what it knocked over getting there. Mara sat in the wagon bed with Tessa, who had decided immediately that sitting beside Mara was preferable to sitting beside her father, and who spent the first 2 miles quietly examining Mara's coat buttons with the focused interest of a person who is too polite to stare at a bruise and needs somewhere else to put her eyes. "Mama had buttons like these," Tessa said, except hers were pearl. Mara looked down at the ordinary brown buttons on her coat. "When did you lose her?" "I was 4. Tessa said it, the way children say things that have been said so many times they've gone smooth with handling. "I don't remember much. Just her hands. And how she smelled like the soap she made herself." Mara thought about small hands, about soap, about the particular cruelty of being 4 years old and losing the person around whom your entire world orbits. "What kind of soap?" she asked. Tessa looked at her with surprised eyes, like it was the first time anyone had asked that. Lavender, she said. Papa tried to make it once after. It came out wrong. He burned the first batch. From the front of the wagon, Gideon said, without turning around, it was a reasonable attempt. It smelled like horses, Tessa told Mara, in a tone that was trying very hard not to be a giggle. It did not smell like horses, Gideon said. A little like horses, Tessa said. Mara looked at the back of Gideon Voss's neck and watched the muscles there shift in a way that suggested he was working at not smiling. She looked out at the Wyoming landscape and felt for the first time in several days something small and cautious stir in her chest that was not dread. She didn't name it. She had learned to be careful about naming things too early. The ranch house was larger than she'd expected and lonelier than any large space ought to be. You could feel it the moment you stepped through the door, that particular silence of a place that used to hold more life and hadn't yet adjusted to holding less. The kitchen was functional and joyless. The front room had a good fireplace and furniture arranged by a person toward furniture placement, but not comfort. There were no curtains in the windows. There was a child's drawing tacked to the wall beside the staircase. A horse and 3 figures, 2 large and 1 small, drawn in the unsteady lines of a child who was 4 or 5 when she drew it. The crayon colors had faded. Tessa watched Mara look at the drawing. I made it before Mama died, Tessa said. Papa keeps it there. Mara kept her voice even. It's a good horse, she said. Tessa tilted her head. It's supposed to be Ranger. He's brown, but I only had orange. Orange is close enough. Gideon had carried her bag in and set it near the staircase with a certain deliberateness that suggested he had thought about where to put it and chose a neutral location. He stood in the middle of his own front room with the particular discomfort of a man who is doing something he planned for months and is now discovering that the plan and the reality have diverged significantly. I should explain the arrangement, he said. You don't have to tonight, Mara said. I want to be clear about it. He said it firmly but not unkindly. Because I don't want there to be confusion later. You're not here to repay anything. You didn't choose to get robbed on the road. What happened on that stage isn't any measure of who you are, and I won't treat it like it is. He paused. You'll have your own room, your own space. You owe me nothing. If after a week or a month you decide this isn't what you want, you leave, and I'll see you have enough for the stage. Mara studied him. That's a generous arrangement. It's a fair one, he said. I wrote to the agency for help. You came 600 miles and got knocked around for the trouble. The least I can do is not add to your difficulties. What if I turn out to be useless? Mara asked. She meant it seriously. What if your hands think you've lost your mind, bringing a woman in off the road who can't even hold her bag together? Can you cook? Yes. Can you sew? Well enough. Can you keep a child from driving me to the edge of my patience on days when I have no patience left? Mara glanced at Tessa, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, eating an apple and watching concentration with the bright attention of someone who does not realize she is the subject of it. I can try, Mara said. Then you're not useless, Gideon said. Get some sleep. Tessa, stop eavesdropping. I'm eating an apple, Tessa said with dignity. You can eat it somewhere else. The room they gave her was at the end of the upstairs hall, small and clean, with a window that looked out over the north pasture. The bed had been made up with fresh linens she could tell from the smell of them, the particular cold, clean smell of sheets that have been aired outdoors. Someone had done that before she arrived. She stood in the doorway and looked at the made bed and felt something in her throat that she refused to let become anything larger. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened her broken bag. She took out what was left, the pocket watch, the shattered pieces of the wooden horse. She arranged them on the small table beside the bed, which was the first place she'd had to put them since Missouri. Her husband Caleb had carried the watch every day of their marriage. Their son Thomas, 2 years old, not yet big enough for a real haircut when the fever took him, had loved the toy horse above every other object on earth. She had carried both things 600 miles because she was not ready to put them down, and she suspected she never would be entirely, and she had made a kind of peace with that. She lay down on the made bed in her ruined dress, because she was too tired to change. She was asleep in under 3 minutes. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of a child attempting to be quiet, which sounds nothing like actual quiet, And everything like a small person trying very hard and failing in the specific way that is somehow louder than regular noise. Tessa was sitting on the floor outside Mara's door when Mara opened it. The child had a cup of coffee in both hands, held with the extreme care of someone who has been told not to spill it under any circumstances. Papa made it, Tessa said. He said not to bring it up, but then he made it, so I think he wanted me to. Mara looked at the coffee. She looked at the child. She crouched down and took the cup carefully from Tessa's hands. Thank you, she said. Tessa sat there on the floor watching her drink it with those calm old eyes. After a moment, she said, Your face looks better. Mara touched the bruise. Still sore. Martha Henley's papa hit her mama once, Tessa said, with the flat directness of a child reporting observable fact. Did your husband hit you? No, Mara said. It was robbers. On the stage, Tessa absorbed this. Papa's not like that, she said. He doesn't hit. He gets quiet instead. When he's angry, he just gets very quiet, and then he goes outside and chops wood until he stops. Mara considered this. That's probably better than hitting. We have a lot of firewood, Tessa agreed. From below, Gideon's voice came up the stairs without particular urgency. Tessa. Let her drink that in peace. I am, Tessa called back. You're talking at her. Talking isn't the same as not in peace. Tessa looked at Mara with an expression that said she considered this argument definitively won. Mara drank her coffee on the floor in the upstairs hall with a 7-year-old sitting next to her, and the Wyoming morning came through the window at the end of the hall in long, flat slats of light, and she did not think about Missouri. She thought about nothing at all, which was the closest she'd come to rest in longer than she could precisely name. The ranch hands took her measure at breakfast. There were 3 of them: Cutter, who was old enough to have opinions about everything, and young enough to still say them out loud; Pike, who was quieter and watchful; and a boy of about 17 named Emmett, who did most of what the other 2 told him and was still in the process of learning which of their habits to imitate and which to leave alone. They ate at the long kitchen table, and Mara served the food she'd found in the kitchen and made without being asked, because making herself useful felt safer than sitting and being looked at. The biscuits were a little uneven because she didn't know the stove yet. The eggs were good. The coffee was strong. Cutter ate in silence for about 4 minutes, which appeared to be his limit. You the mail order? He asked. Cutter, Gideon said. Just asking. Yes, Mara said, I am. Cutter looked at her face. Then at her dress, which she'd done her best to mend overnight, with a needle and thread she'd found in the room's small bureau drawer. Stage robbery? Stage robbery, she confirmed. He seemed to decide something. Biscuits are good, he said, and reached for another one, and that was apparently the full measure of his acceptance process, because he did not say another word to her that morning that wasn't practical. Pike ate and said nothing, but he looked at her once a long, level look and nodded slightly, which she understood to mean something, though she wasn't sure precisely what. Emmett stared at his plate whenever she looked in his direction, which was ordinary enough. Gideon, at the head of the table, drank his coffee and watched all of this without appearing to watch it, in the way of a man who has gotten very good at seeing things without making it obvious that he sees them. After the hands went out to work, Tessa stayed at the table drawing on the back of an envelope while Mara washed the dishes. The kitchen was quiet except for the scratch of the pencil and the water in the basin. You don't have to do that, Gideon said from the doorway. I know, Mara said. She kept washing. He stood there a moment. My wife used to say the same thing to me when I'd try to help her in here. He said it carefully. The way you test ice before you put your weight on it, that she knew she didn't have to. Mara turned to look at him over her shoulder. Her name was Rosalie, he said. Not like he expected her to respond. Just like he needed to say the name out loud, the way people sometimes do. Tell me about her sometime, Mara said. When you want to. He looked surprised. Most people, she had found, expected you to treat the dead like a subject to be avoided for everyone's comfort. You want to hear about her? You've got a picture of your daughter's drawing on the wall, and not a single curtain in the house, Mara said. I think you've been carrying her alone for a while. It doesn't have to be like that. Gideon Voss stood in the doorway of his kitchen on a cold October morning and looked at the woman washing his dishes like he wasn't entirely sure what to do with her, which was honest and understandable. She didn't know what to do with him either. But Tessa was drawing on her envelope, and the coffee was still warm, and outside the wind had eased up a little, and for the moment, that was enough. It was, Mara thought, a place to start. The curtains went up on a Tuesday. Mara hadn't planned it as any kind of statement. She'd found the fabric in the back of a chest in the spare room, a bolt of dark blue cotton, still good, barely touched, and she'd asked Gideon if he minded, and he'd said he didn't mind, and so she cut and hemmed and hung them, while Tessa handed her pins and offered opinions about which window needed them most urgently. By noon, the front room looked different. Not transformed, not the kind of before, and after a person would remark on to company, just less empty, like a room that had remembered it was supposed to be lived in. Gideon came in from the south pasture at midday, stopped in the doorway, and looked at the windows for a long moment. They were in the chest, Mara said from the kitchen. If you'd rather they went back. No, he said. They're fine. He hung his coat on the hook by the door and went to wash up. And Mara listened to the ordinary sounds of him moving through his house and decided not to read anything into the way he'd looked at the windows. People looked at things. It didn't always mean something. But Tessa, setting the table with more rattlings than was strictly necessary, caught Mara's eye and smiled the private smile of a child who has decided something and intends to keep it to herself for now. The first 2 weeks at Blackthorn Ranch, and how much a household could fall apart when no one was paying attention to the details. It wasn't neglect, exactly. Gideon kept the ranch running with the grim efficiency of a man who has no margin for error, and the hands worked hard, and the cattle were healthy, and nothing that mattered for the operation of a working ranch had been allowed to slide. But the house itself, the inside of it, the daily living machinery, had been running on minimum effort for 3 years. The pantry was organized the way a person organizes things when they're trying to find things fast and not particularly caring how it looks. The mending basket was full to overflowing with shirts and socks that had been waiting so long they'd settled into permanent wrinkles. Tessa's hair was often half-brushed, her braids the work of a father who had learned to braid by watching and doing, and had gotten to functional, but no further. Mara didn't say any of this out loud. She simply started doing things. She cleared the pantry and reorganized it in a way that made sense. Most of it's when she worked through the mending basket in the evenings, sitting by the fire, while Gideon read at the other end of the room, and Tessa drew or played with the carved wooden animals on the shelf. She braided Tessa's hair each morning in the kitchen while the oatmeal cooked, and Tessa sat very still for it, which Gideon observed once had never happened when he'd attempted the same task. She used to cry, he said, watching from across the kitchen with his coffee. You were pulling, Tessa said, with the serenity of someone who considers the matter settled. I was not pulling. A little pulling, Tessa said. She met Mara's eyes in the small mirror propped on the windowsill. He tries hard, she added generously. Mara kept her face neutral and finished the braid. There, she said. Go eat. Tessa slid off the stool and went to her bowl, and Gideon looked at Mara across the kitchen with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that look of a man who is recalculating something he thought he understood. She likes you, he said. It came out a little like an accusation and a little like wonder, and she understood that for him those two things were currently the same. She's easy to like back, Mara said. He looked at his coffee. She wasn't easy for a long time after Rosalie. He said it like he was reporting a fact, not asking for sympathy. She stopped talking much. The hands didn't know what to do with her, and neither did I. She started again gradually. But he stopped. Never what? She's never sat still for hair braiding before today, he said. In 3 years. Mara thought about what that meant and didn't say any of the things she might have, because some things don't need to be spoken to be heard. The townspeople were another matter. Red Hollow was small enough that everyone's business was common knowledge within about 48 hours, and the story that circulated about the mail-order bride, Gideon Voss, had collected from the road, bruised, broke, and baggage poor had gone through at least 3 versions by the time Mara first came into town with Gideon and Tessa for supplies. She felt the looks. She had enough practice with being looked at by the time she was 28 that she could feel the specific weight of different kinds, the curious look, the pitying look, the evaluating look that tried to determine whether you were worth pity or judgment. The women in front of Harker's dry goods store delivered a version of all 3 in the span of the 30 seconds it took for Mara to climb down from the wagon. A woman named Helen Kress, who appeared to be the unofficial organizing intelligence of Red Hollow's social order, came forward with the particular bright-eyed friendliness that means a person wants information, and side warmth is the most efficient extraction tool. You must be the woman from Missouri, Helen said. Mara Ellsworth, Mara said. Yes, we heard about your trouble on the stage. Helen's eyes went briefly to the bruise, which had faded to a yellowish shadow but was still visible. Terrible business. Are you quite recovered? Quite, Mara said. And how are you finding Wyoming? Cold, Mara said. Helen laughed, and some of it was genuine. That is absolutely correct. She leaned slightly forward, the lean of a person about to ask something they've already decided to ask. And how are you finding Blackthorn Ranch? Large, Mara said. Well built. Good soil in the kitchen garden. If it gets worked this winter before the ground freezes solid. Helen blinked. She had clearly expected something more personal, or at least more useful for retelling. Yes, she said, I suppose. Mara smiled at her pleasantly and went into the dry goods store. Inside, she heard Gideon behind her, quiet as always, and Tessa's hand found hers without Tessa appearing to think about it, and Mara held it without thinking about it either. And they moved through the store together, and the woman behind the counter watched with the thoughtful expression of someone updating an inventory. Cutter was the first of the hands to say anything useful to her directly, which she hadn't expected because he'd struck her as the kind of man who considers opinions a form of personal property not to be distributed freely. It was the third week, a Thursday, and she'd brought lunch out to the hands in the near pasture because the wind had dropped and it was almost warm. And sometimes people need to eat outside when they've been working hard in the cold and the sun finally appears. Cutter took his plate and ate for a while and then said, without preamble, he hasn't talked about Rosalie to anyone since the first winter. Mara looked at him. Pardon? Gideon. He told you her name the first week. Pike heard him. Cutter ate another bite. Pike told me. He said it like you'd want to know it was a thing. It was just talking, Mara said. Not for him, it wasn't. Cutter didn't say it with any particular sentiment. He said it the way you say something that's simply true. He went about 2 years not saying her name to anyone. Tessa says it. He just didn't. Mara looked out at the pasture. The cattle moved slowly in the thin autumn sun. Why are you telling me this? Cutter considered. Because you're going to be here a while, he said. And you might as well know who you're dealing with. He's a fair man and a hard worker, and he'll do right by you if you do right by him. But he holds things in until they calcify. You'll need to know that. And you're the one who tells me because Pike won't, and Emmett doesn't know enough yet. Cutter took the last of his bread and stood up. And because Tessa drew you into that pictures last night. What picture? Cutter glanced at her sideways. The one on the kitchen wall, the horse and the 3 people. He gathered his plate. She added a 4th figure, in red, because that's apparently a color she associates with you. Most of it's went scaunt. I saw it this morning when I came in for coffee. He walked back toward the fence, and Mara sat with her lunch going cold and thought about a 7-year-old quietly adding a 4th figure to a drawing she'd made before her mother died, and something in her chest did a thing she didn't have a name for yet, but recognized as important. She checked the drawing that evening, while Tessa was already upstairs, and Gideon was out checking the north fence. The crayon figures had been there so long the paper had gone soft at the edges. And there, slightly separated from the original 3, a little smaller, a little tentative, drawn in the red crayon, was a new figure. It had dark lines for hair and a small dot for a face and arms that extended slightly outward, the far a child draws a person who is not yet sure how close to stand. Mara stood in front of it for a while. She heard Gideon come in the back door and stamp his boots and hang up his coat. She heard him stop in the hallway. She added to it, he said, yes. He came and stood beside her. They looked at the drawing together. She hasn't touched that picture in 3 years, he said. I know Cutter told me. He was quiet. Then Cutter talks too much. He talks exactly the right amount, Mara said. For a man everyone assumes isn't paying attention. Gideon almost smiled. She'd been watching for what a smile looked like on him, because she'd suspected from the beginning it existed somewhere under all that careful composure. It looked like the corner of his mouth shifting a 1/4 inch and his eyes doing something different. It lasted about 2 seconds. She likes you, he said for the second time. But it didn't sound like an accusation now. I know, Mara said. I like her too. She meant it simply. She hadn't expected to, or she had expected the liking to be practical, the affection you develop for a child you're responsible for, measured and useful. Instead, it had been immediate and inconvenient, and entirely specific to Tessa, who was strange and funny and older than her years in ways that made Mara's chest ache in the particular place where Thomas used to live. She hadn't told Gideon about Thomas yet. She would have to. But not tonight. She told him about Thomas on a Sunday evening in November, 3.5 weeks after she arrived. They'd fallen into a habit of sitting on the porch after supper on the nights that weren't too cold, which was fewer and fewer as autumn deepened. Tessa went to bed at 8, and the hands were in the bunkhouse, and the ranch went quiet, in a way that wasn't lonely, exactly, but was very aware of itself. Gideon drank coffee on his porch with the same focused quiet he brought to everything else, and Mara had started bringing her mending out, and they would sit companionably, not always talking, which she had not expected from a man who'd placed an advertisement for company, but was apparently constitutionally suited to silence. "I had a son," she said. The silence didn't change shape immediately. He let her have the sentence. "How old?" 2 years old, she said. "Thomas. He got sick in the summer of '82. The fever went too high too fast. There wasn't anything," she stopped. "There wasn't a doctor close enough. Nothing I could do was enough." She said it cleanly because she'd had 3 years to sand the sentence down to something she could speak without coming apart. The thing underneath the sentence was not clean at all, but she kept that part where it lived. "And your husband," Gideon said. "Caleb died the winter before. Accident on the road. So it was just Thomas and me for 8 months, and then it was just me." She looked at her mending. "I'd been waiting tables in Sedalia when I saw your advertisement. I didn't want to keep doing that. I wasn't sure what I wanted, but I thought maybe useful was a place to start." She heard him set down his coffee. "Mara." She looked up. He was watching her with that direct, undecorated look of his, the look that didn't soften things unnecessarily, but wasn't unkind. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it. You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said. "I'm saying it because it's true. Losing a child." He stopped, his jaw moved. "I don't know how a person survives that." "The same way anyone survives anything," Mara said. "You just keep waking up in the morning." "That's it?" "That's it." She looked out at the dark. "Some mornings it's harder than others. But that's all there is." He was quiet for a long time. Then Rosalie died from complications, after what should have been a simple illness. The doctor came too late. Tessa was in the next room. He said it the way she had said, hers sanded down, functional, the raw thing held below the surface. "I've spent 3 years being afraid of illness because of it. Every time Tessa sneezes twice, He didn't finish. "I know," Mara said. "I know you know," he said. "That's the strange thing." They sat in the cold for another half-hour without saying much else. And when Mara went inside, she felt lighter, in a way she couldn't entirely account for, which was not the same as better, but was adjacent to it. And she decided that would do for now. November came in hard and changed the rhythm of everything. The days shortened until they were barely enough to get the essential work done, and the cold shifted from autumn cold, which was bracing, to winter cold, which was serious and did not care about your plans. The cattle needed more attention. The hands worked longer hours and came in for supper with the particular exhaustion of men who have been fighting weather all day and know they'll be doing it again tomorrow. Mara cooked larger and started earlier and kept the stove going, which meant the kitchen was Smith's room in the house by midday, which meant it became the room people came to. Emmett started finding reasons to be inside more often. Cutter began lingering over his second cup of coffee in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee. Even Pike, who was the most self-sufficient of the three, took the night to sitting in the kitchen doorway in the evenings. Nights he didn't go straight to the bunkhouse, his back against the frame, not really talking, just present. It happened gradually enough that Mara didn't mark the specific moment when the kitchen became a gathering place, rather than just a room. She just looked up one evening and noticed that all 4 of them were in or near it, Cutter at the table, Pike in the doorway, Emmett on the back steps, Gideon reading in the front room with the door open so the heat could move, and Tessa was in the middle of telling an extremely long story about something that had happened to her at the one-room schoolhouse that week. And everyone was half listening in the way people listen when they're not required to, and choose to anyway. And then Tessa said, with the storyteller's sense of a captive audience, "Mrs. Garrett said that Willie Potts had copied my answer on the arithmetic, and I said I didn't think he could have, because Willie Potts always gets everything wrong, and my answer was right. And Mrs. Garrett, was your answer right? Cutter asked. Tessa fixed him with an expression of serene certainty. My answers are always right. Pike made a sound that might have been a laugh. And Mrs. Garrett said I shouldn't say things like that about other students, even if they were true, which I thought was a strange rule. It's a common rule, Mara said from the stove. People prefer kindness to accuracy sometimes. Tessa considered this, even when accuracy is kinder in the long run. The kitchen went quiet in a considering way. Cutter looked at Mara. Mara looked at Tessa. That, Mara said, is a genuinely complicated question. Ask me again in 10 years. Tessa absorbed this with the philosophical acceptance of a child who has learned that some answers require waiting, and continued her story. And the kitchen stayed warm, and outside the wind went at the walls in that flat, determined Wyoming way. And Mara stood at the stove and thought, this is what a house is supposed to sound like. She didn't say it. She just thought it quietly, to herself, where it was safer. The morning Helen Kress came to the ranch, Mara was in the kitchen garden turning the last of the soil before the ground froze for good. It was cold work that she'd put off too long, and she was doing it with more force than was strictly necessary, because there is something satisfying about physical labor when your thoughts are moving faster than you want them to. Helen arrived in a small buggy with another woman, a Mrs. Alderton, rounder and quieter than Helen, who seemed to function as a kind of social counterweight. Helen had a basket with her, which meant she had thought about this visit in advance and was performing a gesture. We wanted to bring something, Helen said, handing over the basket, preserves and a loaf of bread, and to see how you were settling in. Settling well, Mara said. She set the basket down and pulled off her work gloves. Come inside. I have coffee on. This was clearly not what Helen had expected, which told Mara something useful about what Helen had imagined she would find at Blackthorn Ranch. Possibly a woman who was struggling or overwhelmed, or visibly failing at the task of frontier domesticity in some way that would confirm the version of the story Red Hollow had been telling itself. What she found instead was a woman who had been turning frozen soil for 2 hours and was now going to offer her coffee without any particular fuss. They sat at the kitchen table. Mrs. Alderton looked around with genuine appreciation. You've done a great deal with this house, she said. It was well, Margaret, Helen said. It was very bare before, Mrs. Alderton said, undeterred. I came once to bring a meal after Rosalie passed, and it was... She stopped herself, aware she was possibly being indelicate. It's much warmer now. I just reorganized some things, Mara said, and hung curtains. The curtains make a difference, Mrs. Alderton said with real conviction. Helen set her cup down. People in town are talking about you, she said, with the directness of a woman who has decided that since she can't get information through warmth, she'll try honesty. They wonder why Gideon kept me, Mara said. Helen had the grace to look slightly abashed. Some people expected he might send you back, given the circumstances. The circumstances being that I arrived broke and bruised. Yes. Mara looked at her coffee. He's a decent man, she said. That's the answer. And are you... Helen stopped, rearranged whatever she'd been about to say. Are you content? Out here? It was a genuine question. Mara could hear it. Under the social maneuvering, there was actual human curiosity, the kind that wanted a real answer rather than a useful one. I think contentment is something you build, Smar said. It's not something you arrive with. She looked up. I'm building it. That's the honest answer. Helen looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once, and something in her expression shifted slightly, like a lock being reconsidered. Gideon Voss, Helen said carefully, was not an easy man to know even before Rosalie. He's become considerably less easy since. She paused. What I mean to say is, it won't be a simple life out here with him. No, Mara said. I expect not. Does that bother you? Mara thought about Missouri, about the particular loneliness of a woman with no family left, waiting tables in Sedalia, existing in a way that felt like less than living. She thought about the kitchen at Blackthorn Ranch at supper time, full of noise and firelight and a child's voice and the smell of food cooking. Simple lives are overrated, she said. Helen almost smiled. It was a different kind of smile than the first one she'd offered, in the street smaller and more honest. I think, she said, that you might do all right out here. After they left, Mara went back to the garden and finished turning the soil. Tessa got her first real look at what lived between Mara and grief on a Wednesday afternoon in late November, when she came home from school and found Mara sitting at the kitchen table with the broken pieces of the wooden toy horse laid out in front of her. Mara had been trying to fit the pieces back together. Most of its windows dark, the horse had broken into 4 sections when the bag hit the road, and she'd kept all the pieces because she couldn't bring herself not to, even knowing they wouldn't fit cleanly. She was holding 2 pieces together and looking at the gap between them when Tessa came in. Tessa stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the pieces on the table. "What's that?" she asked. Mara had thought she was alone. She hadn't decided in advance how much she wanted to explain. "It was my son's toy," she said. "It broke on the road." Tessa's windows were dark, came to the table and looked at the pieces with the focused attention she gave everything she considered worth understanding. "Can it be fixed?" "I don't think so, not properly." Mara set the 2 pieces down. "But I keep trying anyway." Tessa studied the broken horse. She reached out and touched one piece with the tip of her finger, carefully, the way children touch things that belong to someone else's sadness. "What was his name?" "Thomas," Mara said. "How old was he?" 2. Tessa thought about this. 2 is very young, she said. "Yes. He never got to be 7. No." Tessa sat down across from Mara. She looked at the horse pieces. She looked at Mara. "Papa has Mama's comb," she said, on the shelf in his room. "He never uses it, but he never puts it away." Mara looked at her. "I think it's the same as your horse," Tessa said. "You keep the thing because you keep the thing." Mara sat for a moment with that. A 7-year-old had just said something that 3 years of trying to explain her own behavior to herself hadn't managed. She felt the pressure behind her eyes that meant something was happening. She needed to hold in check. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly right." Tessa nodded, satisfied. She reached across the table and put her hand over the broken pieces of the horse, not taking them, just covering them lightly with her small palm. "You can keep them here," she said. "Nobody will touch them." Gideon heard about the toy horse from Tessa that evening because Tessa told him things with the frank completeness of a child who doesn't yet understand that some information is meant to be private. He didn't say anything to Mara about it directly. But the next morning, there was a small wooden shelf on the wall of her room, freshly built, at exactly the right height to hold the things on her bedside table. She stood looking at it for a long time before she moved the watch and the horse pieces onto it, one by one. She didn't say thank you out loud, because some things don't need to be spoken to be heard, and she thought Gideon probably understood that. December came, and with it the cold that was not posturing. The kind of cold that meant business and had the infrastructure to back it up. The first bad cold spell hit in the second week of December, and the ranch responded the way working ranches respond to weather, with urgency and labor, and very little discussion of anything that wasn't immediately practical. The hands were out before dawn, Gideon with them, and Mara kept the stove going and food readies, and Tessa occupied inside, which was its own sustained project, because Tessa had opinions about being kept inside. "I could help," Tessa said for the 3rd time that morning. "You could," Mara agreed, from the stove, "in the kitchen. I means outside." "I know what you mean. Emmett's only 3 years older than me, and he's out there. Emmett is also 14 inches taller than you and has been working ranches since he was 12. Mara set a bowl of oatmeal in front of her. "Eat." Tessa ate with the aggrieved expression of someone who considers the injustice documented and intends to raise it again. "When I'm older," she said, "I'm going to help." "When you're older, yes." "How much older?" "Older than now." Mara sat across from her with her own bowl. "Did your father ever teach you to rope?" Tessa looked up. "A little. Not properly." "We could practice inside," Mara said, "with the short rope on the hook by the door. It'll drive you less out of your mind than sitting still." Tessa's expression shifted from aggrieved to interested. "You know how to rope?" "My husband taught me," Marissa said. "I was never good at it, but I know the basics." Tessa was off her stool before the bowl was empty. They practiced roping in the front room for an hour, which did no harm to the furniture, and enormous good to Tessa's mood, and when Gideon came in at midday to find his daughter attempting to rope a chair leg with an expression of absolute concentration, and Mara calling instructions from across the room, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the scene with the expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was somewhere in that territory. "She's not bad," Mara said. "She's got the release." "I can rope a chair," Tessa announced. "Mara says the release is the important part." The release is the important part, Gideon agreed. She taught me, Tessa said, with the particular pride of recent acquisition. Gideon looked at Mara over Tessa's head. Something passed between them, not a conversation, exactly, but the thing that happens when two people have been watching each other carefully enough that they can communicate without words, which is a thing that takes time to develop and means something about the time that has been spent. Lunch is ready when you want it, Marissa said. He nodded and went to wash up, and Tessa went back to roping the chair, and Mara went back to the kitchen, and the cold pressed at the windows, and the house held against it without fuss, the way a solid thing holds. It was Pike who said it plainly, the way Pike said everything once, quietly, without preamble. He'd come in for coffee late one evening when the others were already in the bunkhouse, and Mara was still in the kitchen, going over the accounts Gideon had asked her to look at, because her arithmetic was better than his, which she'd mentioned once and which he'd acted on without comment. Pike poured his coffee and stood by the stove to warm his hands and looked at her working at the table. "You know what you've done," he said. Mara looked up. "Done? To this place. It's different." She waited. "He was going under," Pike said. Not dramatically. Just factually, not fast. But he was going. You can do that, go slow. Not stop working, not stop functioning. Just go quieter and quieter until one day there's not much left. He looked at his coffee. 3 years is a long time to carry a place by yourself. He wasn't alone, Mara said. He had Tessa, which made it harder, not easier, Pike said. Because everything had to be for her and nothing could be for him. He set down his cup. "I'm not saying this to embarrass you. I'm saying it because you should know that what you've done here mattered, even if nobody's said it in plain language." He went out, and the door let in a brief wall of cold air and then closed behind him. Mara sat at the kitchen table with the accounts in front of her and the fire going low, and she thought about a man going quiet and quieter over 3 years, and a child drawing a new figure in red crayon onto a picture she'd made before the loss, and a shelf appearing on a wall without discussion, and curtains that made a room remember it was supposed to be lived in, she thought. "I came here with empty hands and nothing left, and somehow I am holding more than I know what to do with." She didn't cry. She was getting better, she thought, at feeling the full weight of something without being flattened by it. That was probably progress. She went back to the accounts, and the fire burned down, and outside the first real snow of winter began falling on Blackthorn Ranch, settling over everything with the patient indifference of weather that does not care what it covers, only that it does. The snow that started in December didn't stop being serious about itself until well into January, and by the third week of the new year, 1886, Blackthorn Ranch had settled into the particular rhythm of a working place in deep winter. Everything reduced to what was necessary, nothing wasted. The days measured not by the clock but by the light, which arrived late and left early and didn't apologize for either. Tessa had a cold the first week of January, a regular cold runny nose, mild cough, the ordinary misery of a child who wants to be outside and is being kept in. Mara made her broth and kept her warm and watched her with the kind of attention that looks like ordinary care and is actually something more vigilant underneath. Gideon noticed the watching. He didn't say anything about it. He just came in more often than he needed to, on various practical pretexts, and stood in doorways longer than the pretexts required. The cold passed in 4 days. Both adults breathed easier, without discussing the fact that they'd been holding their breath. But the watching didn't stop. It just went quieter, became part of the background of daily life at the ranch, the way certain sounds become background until they suddenly aren't. Mara didn't fully understand what she was watching for until the second week of January, when the temperature dropped to the kind of cold that has no mercy in it, and she woke at 4 a.m. to a sound from down the hall that she had heard once before and had spent 3 years trying to forget. A child's cough. Not the ordinary cold cough, thick and loose and self-resolving. This one was dry and high, and had a particular quality to it, a tightness that put Mara out of bed before she was fully awake, moving down the hall in her stockings without stopping for her shoes. Tessa's room was small and faced north, which meant it got the worst of the winter wind, and the temperature in it was several degrees colder than the rest of the house, despite the small stove in the corner that Mara had been keeping going since the cold spell started. Tessa was sitting up in bed when Mara came in, and her face in the lamplight was wrong, in the specific way that makes a person's stomach drop before their brain has finished processing why. Too much color in her cheeks, eyes that were too bright. Mara crossed the room and put her hand on Tessa's forehead and felt what she had feared and had been afraid to name. And for exactly 3 seconds, she stood very still with her hand on a sick child's face and let herself be terrified, because she had learned that if you don't allow yourself 3 seconds of honest fear, you spend the rest of the crisis flinching away from it. And flinching costs more than facing. 3 seconds. Then she moved. "How long have you felt like this?" she asked. "I don't know." Tessa's voice was rougher than it should have been. "I was cold before and then I was hot." "When did the hot start?" "Before I woke up," Tessa said. "I don't know. It woke me up." Mara felt her neck swollen glands, both sides. She checked her breathing, which was faster than it ought to be and had a faint labor to it that she did not like at all. She pulled the blankets closer and tucked them firmly around Tessa's shoulders. "I'm going to wake your father," she said. "I need you to stay warm and stay still. Can you do that?" Tessa looked at her with those 2 bright eyes. "Is it bad?" Mara kept her voice even and her face steady. "It's a fever. We're going to take care of it. Stay still." She went to Gideon's room and opened the door without knocking, because the situation had passed the point where manners were the relevant consideration. He was already half-awake ranchers in deep winter sleep, like men, waiting for something to go wrong. 1 level below full consciousness at all times, and he sat up the moment the door opened. "Tessa," Mara said, just that. He was out of bed before she finished the word. She watched him go into Tessa's room and watched his face as he touched his daughter's forehead, and she saw exactly what she'd expected to see, not panic, not immediately. Most of its windows were dark, but the particular white compression of a man who has had his worst fear materialized in front of him and is using everything he has to hold himself together while he processes it. His jaw set. His hand stayed on Tessa's face a beat longer than it needed to. "The fever's high," Mara said from the doorway. "Not the highest I've seen, but it needs to come down." "How high?" "I'd estimate 103. Maybe 4. I don't know yet." She was already thinking through what she had. Cool water. Cloths. The willow bark she'd laid in on instinct 2 weeks ago at the general store in Red Hollow, when something she couldn't name had told her to. Whatever food Tessa could keep down. Broth, not solid. "We need cool water and cloths for her head. And I need to know if there's a doctor within reasonable distance." "Doc Haswell," Gideon said. "He's in Greymount, 40 miles. "In this weather?" His jaw moved. "I can have Emmett ride." "In this weather," Mara said, "a 40-mile ride could take all day. Could take longer if the drifts are bad on the North Road." She watched his face. "I'm not saying don't send for him. I'm saying don't count on him being here tomorrow morning." Gideon looked at her over Tessa's head. The question in his face was not one she'd expected to see, from a man who generally kept his expressions under tight management. It was raw and scared, and asking something without words that she needed to answer, honestly. "I've done this before," she said. Not gently, because gentle wasn't what he needed right now. Straight. Practical. "I know what I'm doing. I'm going to need your help, not your panic. Can you give me that?" The rawness in his face contracted and steadied. It didn't disappear. She didn't want it to disappear. She wanted it where she could see it so she knew what she was working with, but it organized itself into something she could use. "What do you need?" he said. "Cool water, clean cloths. More wood on the stove in her room before we open the window a crack. We need cold air moving, but we need the room not to freeze. Broth started in the kitchen. And Emmett on the road to Greymount at first light. So if the fever doesn't break by tomorrow, we have a doctor coming." He was already moving before she finished. The first 12 hours were not as bad as they became. The fever ran high, and Tessa was miserable but coherent, complaining about the cold cloths and asking 3 times how long she had to stay in bed and falling into fractious, restless sleep between bouts of coughing that made Mara lean forward and watch her chest and count the breaths until she was satisfied. Gideon sat on the other side of the bed with the specific rigidity of a man who has been told his job is to be steady and is applying himself to it with everything he has. Around midday, Tessa opened her eyes and said, clearly, "Papa, you don't have to look like that." "Like what?" Gideon said. "Like something bad is about to happen." A pause. "I don't look like that." "You do," Tessa said. She coughed. Mara lifted her head, helped her drink a little water. When she lay back, Tessa looked at her father and then at Mara. Both of you do, she said. I can see it. Go back to sleep, Gideon said. I'm not tired. You have a fever of 103, Mara said. You're tired. You just don't know it yet. Tessa made a sound of protest that turned into a cough, that turned into Mara's hand on her back and Gideon's hand finding his daughter's under the blanket, and Tessa, for once, did not argue her point further. As Emmett rode for Greymount at first light the following morning, Mara heard him go, heard the horse, heard Gideon's low voice outside giving instructions she couldn't make out. She was still in Tessa's room. She had not slept. By the second day, the fever climbed. 104 by Mara's estimation, which she'd arrived at through the only instruments she had, her hands, her experience, the color of Tessa's face, and the rate of her breathing. The cough had gotten wetter, which could mean the fever was breaking, or could mean fluid settling in the chest, and the difference between those two things was the difference between improvement and serious danger, and she did not yet know which one she was dealing with. She kept the cool cloths going without stopping. She made Tessa drink water every time the child woke, even when Tessa's eyes were too glassy to focus properly. And drinking was a project that required coaxing. She got broth into her twice. She listened to her breathing every hour, pressing her ear gently to Tessa's back, the way the doctor in Sedalia had shown her once, and what she heard was not clear, but it wasn't the thing she feared most. Gideon had stopped leaving the room except for the few minutes every couple of hours, when she made him. You need to eat something, she told him on the afternoon of the second day. I'm fine. You need to eat something, she said again. You can't help her if you fall over. Go eat. Come back. He went. He came back in 15 minutes, which was probably all he could manage, but it was enough. Cutter appeared in the doorway that evening with a plate of food for Mara. He didn't say anything. He set the plate on the chair by the door and looked at Tessa for a moment, and then looked at Mara. She's fighting it, Mara said. Cutter nodded once. She's a Voss, he said. They're stubborn. He looked at Gideon, who was watching his daughter with that white-faced, controlled expression. So was he. He left. Mara ate the food because she needed to, not because she was hungry. The second night was the worst. The fever peaked sometime around midnight, and Tessa, who had been fretfully half-conscious for most of the day, crossed into a state that was both, and neither awake enough to feel the discomfort, too far under to be reasoned with, too hot to rest properly. She moved her head back and forth on the pillow, and made sounds that were not quite words, and Gideon sat beside her and held her hand and kept very still, in the way that told Mara he was spending everything he had on the effort of not falling apart. Mara worked. She changed the cloths. She lifted Tessa's head for water. She tracked the breathing. She checked the stove. She went downstairs twice for more water, and came back both times to find Gideon exactly where she'd left him, in the same position, watching his daughter with an expression she had not seen on him before, and hoped not to see again, a helpless, stripped-down terror that the controlled surface usually kept hidden. Around 2 a.m, Tessa's breathing changed. Mara was at the stove when she heard it, a shift in quality, a slight easing in the labor of each breath, and she crossed the room in 4 steps and put her hand on Tessa's forehead and held it there, counting, feeling. The fever was not gone, but it had moved, slightly, measurably, unmistakably. It had been a wall, and now it was a wall with a crack in it. She's coming down, Mara said. Gideon's head came up. You're sure? Not all the way. But it's moving in the right direction. She kept her hand on Tessa's forehead. The fever is breaking. She heard him exhale not a small sound, but the sound a man makes when he has been holding something enormous for a very long time and is allowed to set it down for a moment. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth and looked at the ceiling and then at his daughter, and the expression on his face was something she had no words for and did not try to name. Keep talking to her, Mara said. She can hear you, even like this. Talk to her. He looked uncertain about what. Anything. Doesn't matter. Just let her hear your voice. He looked at Tessa. He reached out and put his hand on her hair, gently, the way you touch something you're afraid of losing. And then, in a low voice that was rougher than she'd ever heard from him, he started talking. About the ranch. About a foal that had been born in the spring and had a crooked marking on its face that made it look like it was perpetually skeptical. About a time he'd gotten stuck in a drift 3 winters ago and had to dig himself out with his bare hands because he'd left his shovel at the fence line. Small things, real things. The texture of an ordinary life offered up to a sick child in the dark. Mara went to the chair by the window and sat down and kept watching Tessa's chest rise and fall and listened to Gideon's voice fill the room and did not think about Thomas. She tried hard and mostly succeeded. Just before dawn, Tessa surfaced. Not fully, she was still sick, still feverish, still in need of several more days of careful watching. But she opened her eyes with some degree of actual focus and looked at the ceiling, and then looked to the right where her father was, and then looked to the left where Mara was sitting, and said, in a voice gone rough and small from 2 days of fever and coughing, "Mama." The room went absolutely still. Mara understood in the fraction of a second, before she processed it consciously, that Tessa was not fully here, that the word had come from somewhere between sleep and waking, from the place where what you need and what you have get briefly confused. She also understood that the word had landed, that it had traveled across the room and hit her in the chest with a force she had not been prepared for. She looked at Tessa. The child's eyes were on her, clouded with fever, not entirely clear, but on her. Not looking past her, not looking for someone else. "I'm here," Mara said. Her voice came out steady. She didn't know how. Tessa closed her eyes again. Her breathing evened out into the slow, regular rhythm of real sleep for the first time in 2 days. And Mara sat in her chair and kept her eyes on the child, and felt the word sitting in her chest like a coal burning, but warming too, both at once, and she was not prepared for how much the warming hurt. She became aware after a moment that Gideon had not moved. She looked across the bed. He was looking at her, not at Tessa, at her. His face had the particular openness of a man who has just witnessed something he hadn't known he was waiting to see, and who is now reckoning with what it means. She looked back at him. She did not look away, and he did not look away, and between them, in the space over a sleeping, fever-breaking child, something that had been building carefully and cautiously for 3 months settled into a different shape entirely. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said. Doc Haswell arrived late on the 3rd day, preceded by Emmett, who had ridden hard both ways and looked like he'd aged 3 years on the North Road. The doctor was a compact, pragmatic man in his 60s who had been practicing medicine on the Wyoming frontier long enough to have very few illusions about anything. He examines Tessa with the efficient thoroughness of someone who doesn't waste motions, asking questions as he worked, and making small sounds that gave away nothing. Gideon stood against the wall. Mara stood on the other side of the bed. "The fever's broken well," the doctor said. "Chest is clearing. She needs rest and fluids and careful watching for the next week. No exertion." He looked up at Mara. "You managed this yourself?" "Yes," Mara said. He studied her. "Any formal training?" "No, experience." He seemed to understand from her tone that this was not an opening for further questions on that subject. "You did well," he said. "The cool cloths and the consistent fluids, that's the right approach. I've seen adults lose children to fevers like this by keeping them too warm or letting them go too dry." He closed his bag. "Who taught you?" Mara looked at the window. "Nobody," she said. "I learned it from a situation I couldn't afford to fail at, and I failed anyway, and I learned more from that than from anything that worked." The doctor looked at her for a moment. He nodded once, the nod of a man who understands what that means and does not press further. "Keep her in bed for a week," he said. "Broth, water, soft food when she can tolerate it. Send for me if the fever returns or the cough changes." He looked at Gideon. "You have someone who knows what she's doing. That's worth more out here than most people understand." He charged a fair price for the ride and the examination, declined to stay for supper because he had other calls to make, and went back out into the cold. Emmett took his horse. The door closed behind them, and the house went quiet again. Gideon stood in the front room for a moment. He said, "You know what you're doing," he said. He was being kind, Mara said. She was already thinking about broth, about what Tessa could reasonably eat tonight. "He wasn't," Gideon said. "He is not a man who says things to be kind." She looked at him. "You kept her alive," he said. Not dramatically, just directly in the plain-speaking way he said everything. The way she had come to understand was simply how he expressed what mattered. "For 2 days in the worst of it, you kept her alive. I want you to hear me say that." Mara looked at him and thought about 3 months of careful distance and early mornings with coffee and Tessa's hand in hers and a shelf appearing on a wall and curtains going up and a man talking to his sick daughter about a skeptical foal in the dark. She thought about how many things had accumulated between October and January without either of them naming any of them. She thought about how exhausted she was and how the exhaustion had a different texture than grief, heavier in the body, lighter underneath, like something had been put down that had been carried too long. "I heard you," she said. She went to the kitchen to start the broth, and he let her go, and neither of them pushed further than that, because they were both people who had learned to be careful with things that mattered, and this mattered, and careful was right. Tessa recovered with the comprehensive energy of a child who has been still for too long and intends to make up for it. By the 5th day, she was sitting up and eating soft food and talking without stopping, which Mara took as the clearest possible sign of returning health. By the 7th day, she was at the window, watching and expressing opinions about what everyone was doing, and whether they were doing it correctly. By the 10th day, when Mara declared her well enough to be cautious rather than confined, Tessa was down the stairs and in the kitchen before Mara had finished the sentence. "Slowly," Mara said. "I'm going slowly," Tessa said from the kitchen. That was not slowly. It was slow for me. Cutter, who was at the table for breakfast, made no attempt to hide his amusement. Pike, in the doorway, was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has learned that expressions are legally inadmissible. Emmett had the grace to look at his plate. Gideon came in from outside with the cold still on him and stopped when he saw Tessa at the stove in her nightdress and coat, standing on her toes to look into the oatmeal pot. "What are you doing?" he said. "Checking the oatmeal. Why, to see if it's done. That's Mara's job." "I'm helping," Tessa said with enormous dignity. Gideon looked at Mara over his daughter's head. Mara looked back at him with an expression that said, "This is the child you raised. I have done my best. You are welcome." He sat down. He did not argue further. The week after Tessa's recovery was quieter than the weeks before it, in a way that had nothing to do with noise. The ranch functioned as it always had: work and meals and cold, and the steady machinery of a place built to run, but something in the atmosphere of it had shifted in a way that everyone felt, and no one named directly. The hands felt it. Cutter made no comments, which was itself a comment. Pike watched without appearing to. Emmett went about his work with the mild obliviousness of a young man who is aware something is happening among the adults around him, but has no framework for understanding what. Tessa felt it too. Tess felt it too, in the way that children feel things they can't articulate through the skin, through the behavior of the people they love, through the small changes in how rooms feel when certain people are in them together. She watched. She said nothing, which was unusual enough that it was its own kind of statement. What had shifted was this: the careful arrangement that Gideon and Mara had maintained since October, practical, respectful, bounded by clear lines of what this was and what it wasn't, had been reorganized by 3 days in a sick room in the dark. Not broken, not abandoned, reorganized. Like furniture after an earthquake, still the same pieces, but you can see where they really belong now. They moved differently around each other. Not closer, exactly, not yet, not in any way that would have been obvious to a stranger. But the careful performance of distance had been quietly retired, because the fever had made it impossible and then unnecessary, and neither of them had put it back. Mara noticed it one morning when she handed Gideon his coffee and he took it, and their hands were close together for a moment, and neither of them moved immediately, and it wasn't awkward. It was just present, acknowledged. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and they both looked away, and the coffee got drunk, and the morning went on. But the moment had existed, and they both knew it had existed, and that was different from before. Most of its windows were dark. She noticed it again when Tessa fell asleep on the sofa one evening after supper, exhausted from her return to the full energy of being herself, and Gideon got up to carry her upstairs, and Mara got up to get the blanket, and they arrived at the sofa at the same time from different directions and almost collided. And he said, "Sorry," and she said, "No, go ahead," and he picked Tessa up. And Mara tucked the blanket around her in his arms before he moved, and then he went upstairs and stood in the empty front room and listened to his footsteps above her. She wasn't sure what she was feeling. She'd spent 3 years being very careful about not feeling anything she couldn't afford. And this, whatever this was becoming, was something she could not predict the cost of, and that made her want to move slowly and carefully and look at all the angles before she committed to anything. But she also thought about Pike saying he was going under, and she thought about a shelf appearing on her wall without discussion, and she thought about a man talking to his daughter in the dark, about a foal with a skeptical face. And she thought about the word mama in a fever-ruined voice landing in her chest like a coal, burning and warming at once. She thought, I have been careful for 3 years. I have been safe and careful, and I have survived. She thought, surviving and living are not the same thing. She thought, I know the difference. I have lived on both sides of that line. She did not make any decisions that night. She was too tired for decisions. She went to bed, and she lay in the room with the shelf Gideon had built on the wall, with a watch and the broken horse pieces on it, and she looked at the ceiling, and outside the Wyoming winter pressed on the windows, and she did not sleep for a long time. It was Tessa who said it plainly, because Tessa always said things plainly, and because she had been observing the situation for 3 months with the particular clarity of a child who has nothing at stake in the adults behaving correctly, and everything at stake in them being happy. She said it on a Saturday morning while Mara was braiding her hair at the kitchen stove, which had become their established routine, the 20 minutes before breakfast, when the house was mostly quiet and the oatmeal cooked, and Tessa sat on the stool and the braid happened. Do you like my father? Tessa asked. Mara's hands kept moving. Yes, she said, I like your father. More than just regular? Tessa said. She said it with a particular precision of a child who has been thinking about how to ask this and has chosen her words carefully. Mara finished the braid. She tied it off. She put her hands on Tessa's shoulders and came around to look at her, crouching down to be at the same level, and Tessa looked back at her with those grave old eyes that had probably never entirely been 7 years old. What makes you ask? Mara said. Tessa thought about this. When you were in my room when I was sick, she said slowly, and I called you. She stopped. She had been mostly asleep and wasn't sure how much of it she remembered. Did I say something? You were sick, Mara said. You said things. You weren't entirely awake. Did you mind? Tessa asked. What I said, Mara looked at her. No, she said. I didn't mind. Tessa studied her face with the focused attention she brought to everything she considered important. I think, she said, with great seriousness, that I would like it if you stayed. Mara felt the thing in her chest that she had no name for yet, pressing against its borders. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Not just this winter, Tessa said. I mean always. I think I would like it if you stayed always. The kitchen was warm. The oatmeal needed stirring. From somewhere above them, Gideon's footsteps moved across the floor, and in a few minutes he would come down the stairs for his coffee, and the morning would begin in the way mornings at Blackthorn Ranch had learned to begin, with noise and work, and the particular texture of a life being built around people who needed each other more than they had bargained for. Mara put her hand on Tessa's face. Go stir the oatmeal, she said, before it sticks. Tessa went. She asked no more questions. But she was smiling when she turned to the stove, the private smile of a child who has decided something and intends to keep it to herself. Most of its windows were dark, and Mara stood in the kitchen of Blackthorn Ranch and felt the future pressing against the present like weather on a window, and she thought, I know what I want. She hadn't let herself think that in 3 years. It was, she discovered, a more terrifying thought than most of the other thoughts she'd had. It was also underneath the terror something else entirely, something that felt improbably and carefully, and against every reasonable expectation, she had carried 600 miles in a broken bag like the beginning of hope. The morning after Tessa said what she said, Mara woke before dawn and lay in the dark for a long time not sleeping. This was not unusual. She had always been a light sleeper, and the months at Blackthorn Ranch had not cured her of the habit of surfacing at 4 in the morning with her mind already moving. What was unusual was the quality of what her mind was doing. It wasn't the familiar gray circling of grief, the inventory of losses she had taken most morsings for 3 years. It was something else, something more forward-looking, which frightened her in a way the grief no longer did. Because grief she knew the shape of, and this she didn't. She got up before the house, stirred, and went down to the kitchen and started the stove and stood at the window while the coffee boiled and watched the Wyoming dark outside, which was the particular thick dark of deep winter before the snow begins to carry light. She thought about what Tessa had said. She thought about what she had said back. She thought about the fact that she had told a 7-year-old child she wasn't going anywhere without first establishing whether that was actually true, which meant she needed to establish whether it was actually true. The problem with that question was that it had layers. The practical layer was navigable. She was useful here. She had nowhere pressing to go. The arrangement had evolved well beyond what either she or Gideon had originally intended. The practical layer was fine. It was the layer underneath that was the problem, the one that required her to examine not just whether she was staying, but why, and what she wanted from staying, and whether what she wanted was something she had any right to want or any realistic hope of having. She was still standing at the window when she heard Gideon's footsteps on the stairs. He came into those were dark. He came into the kitchen with the settled quiet of a man who has done the same morning routine so many times it requires no thought, and stopped when he saw her already there. He took in the coffee, the window, the way she was standing, and did what she had come to understand was his particular skill. He read the room accurately and responded to what was actually in it rather than what was easier. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept some." She poured him coffee without being asked, because she'd been doing it for 3 months, and it had stopped requiring thought. "I was thinking." "About Tessa?" She looked at him. He was watching her with that direct, undecorated attention of his, the look that didn't decorate things or soften them unnecessarily. She had spent months learning to read that look, and she still wasn't entirely sure she had the full vocabulary of it. "About several things," she said, Tessa included. He drank his coffee. He didn't push. That was one of the things about Gideon Voss that she had catalogued early and kept coming to. He did not push. He created space and waited in it, which was either patience or its own kind of stubbornness, and she thought it was probably both. "She asked me last night if I liked you," Mara said. Something shifted in his face. "What did you tell her?" "That I did." She looked at her coffee. She asked if it was more than just regular. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the wind outside doing its usual business against the walls. Gideon set his cup down carefully on the table. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at her. "What did you tell her?" he asked. Again, in a different register than before. "I didn't answer that one directly," Mara said. "She's 7. Some things need to be figured out before they get explained to a 7-year-old. That's reasonable." A pause. "Have you figured it out?" She looked at him. He looked back at her. In the 3 months since October, they had moved around each other with increasing honesty and decreasing distance, and she knew him well enough by now to know that the question wasn't casual. He was asking because he needed to know, and he was asking directly because that was how he asked everything, and because whatever her answer was, he intended to act on it rather than around it. "I'm working on it," she said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. "That's honest," he said. "I try to be, I know." He turned toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and stood there for a moment with his back to her. She watched his shoulders and waited. "I had a plan," he said, to the door frame. "When I wrote the agency, I had a very clear, very practical plan about what I needed and what I was prepared to offer and what this would be. It was a fair plan. A reasonable plan, it was," Mara said. "You have comprehensively destroyed it," he said. She blinked. He went out without looking back at her, and she heard him on the porch putting on his coat, and then his boots on the steps going down, and then the quiet that meant he was going to the barn, to the Wasson. And she stood in the kitchen holding her coffee and felt something loosen in her chest with an almost audible sound, like ice breaking up in March. She did not have the rest of the morning to think about it, because Tessa came downstairs at 6:30 with the full tilt energy of a child who has been sick for 10 days and intends to treat her recovery as a personal achievement requiring celebration, and the day swallowed the quiet in the way days do. The words stayed with her. She took them out and examined them at intervals throughout the day, the way you tooth with your tongue, elusive tooth with your tongue, repeatedly, carefully, registering both the soreness and the reality of the thing. "You have comprehensively destroyed it." She thought about what it cost him to say that. She knew Gideon Voss well enough by January to know that words like that didn't come easily and didn't come cheap. He was a man who said things once and meant them entirely and expected them to carry the weight he'd put into them without needing to be repeated or elaborated. She had learned to listen to him differently than she listened to most people, less to the volume and more to the specific gravity of individual sentences. That sentence had gravity enough for 10. The conversation she'd been not quite having with herself came to a head 3 days later, in a way she hadn't planned and probably should have seen coming, because it came from Cutter, who had never once in 3 months approached any subject sideways, when he could go straight through it. She was in the barn, checking the hay stores. Gideon had asked her to inventory what remained after the hard cold spell, which was a practical task she had taken on, because practical tasks were useful, and she needed useful things to do with her hands, while her head sorted through everything else. And Cutter came in, ostensibly to check the secondary stall where one of the mares had been favoring her left foreleg. He checked the mare. He looked at the leg. He stood there in the way of a man who has more on his agenda than the foreleg. "You're going to have to decide something," he said. Mara kept counting the hay bales. "What makes you say that?" "Because you've been deciding it since October, and it's January, and the man is not going to keep waiting at that polite distance of his forever." Cutter said it without heat, the way he said most things that were true. He's patient, but he's not a monk. "Cutter, I'm not telling you what to decide. I'm telling you it's time to decide it." He leaned against the stall door. "He won't push you. That's not who he is. He'd let you be comfortable in that arrangement you two have got until spring and through summer and into next fall, and he'd never once make you feel like you owed him anything more. But that's not the same as him not wanting more." Mara set her pencil down. She looked at him. "When did you become the person who gives advice about this kind of thing?" "I've always been that person," Cutter said. "Nobody asks me because I look like I wouldn't be. But I've been watching people do foolish things for 50-some years, and I have opinions." He straightened up. "The mare's leg is fine, by the way. Just stiff from the cold." He went out, and Mara stood in the barn with her inventory and her thoughts, and she thought, everyone in this ranch has an opinion about this except the 2 people it involves. And then she thought, no, both of those people have an opinion. They've just been very careful about where they keep it. She found Gideon that evening, after supper, after Tessa had gone upstairs with her reading, and the hands were in the bunkhouse, and the house had settled into the particular quiet of 10 o'clock in winter. He was in the front room with his account books, which was where he went when he had numbers to work through and didn't want to talk. And she came and sat across from him without preamble and waited until he looked up. He looked up. "I want to tell you something," she said. He closed the account book. He gave her his full attention, which was a thing he did completely. When Gideon Voss was listening to you, you had all of him, not the part of him that wasn't thinking about something else. It was one of the things she had noticed early and kept noticing. "I had a life before I came here," she said. "You know that. Caleb. Thomas. A house in Missouri that stopped feeling like home after the second loss, so I left it." She looked at her hands. "I came here with a practical plan, the same as you. I needed somewhere to be useful. I thought that was enough to want. Just useful." She looked up at him. "I was wrong about that." Gideon said nothing. He was listening with that absolute attention. "I don't know how to do this carefully," she said. "I've been trying to figure out how to do it carefully, and I don't think there is a careful way. There's just the truth, which is that somewhere between October and now, I stopped thinking about being here as a practical arrangement and started thinking about it as..." She stopped. She was not a woman who stumbled over words, and stumbling now felt important to acknowledge. "I don't have a clean word for it." "You don't need a clean word for it," Gideon said. His voice was quiet and even, and she could hear what was underneath it, which was not nothing. "I love Tessa," Mara said. "Not as an obligation. Not because she's part of what I agreed to. She got into my chest somehow, and I don't think she's coming out." The corner of his mouth moved, and She stopped again. She looked at him directly, the way he always looked at her, and decided that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it, the way he did everything, straight, without ornamentation. "I think about you," she said, "not as the man I made an arrangement with, not as the employer or the whatever the technical word is for what we started out as. I think about you the way I haven't thought about anyone since Caleb, and I need you to know that because I've been carrying it around for 2 months, and it is heavy, and I would like to put it down." The room was very quiet. Gideon looked at her for a long time. She watched the things moving through his face, Not the controlled surface, but underneath the things the controlled surface usually kept organized and managed. She watched him let her see them, which was its own kind of answer before he said a word. The original plan, he said finally, the practical arrangement. What I told you the first day in Red Hollow, your own room, your own space, owe me nothing. He paused. I meant all of it. I want you to know I meant it. I know you did. And I also, he stopped. He looked at the closed account book on the table, and she thought she could actually see him choosing his words with the care of a man who doesn't use many and needs them to carry the weight correctly. I also started, sometime around November, to dread the idea of you leaving. Not for Tessa's sake, though that too. For mine. He looked up. That wasn't in the original plan. No, she said. I'm not a man who he stopped again. Started over. I don't do things partway. If I'm in something, I'm in it. I need you to understand that before anything else. Because if this becomes something, it becomes something real. Not an arrangement, not a convenience. I'm not capable of the other kind. I know that, Mara said. I've known that since the first week. And he said it carefully. Because of the shelter, or the room, or Gideon. She said his name and he stopped. I walked 600 miles and got knocked around and arrived at your door with nothing. You treated me like a person and gave me space to be one. That's not a debt. That's just decency. She held his gaze. I'm not here because I owe you. I'm here because I want to be here. That is an enormous difference, and yes, I understand it. Something in his face shifted. It wasn't the almost smile she'd learned to read, the quarter-inch movement. Most of its windows were dark. It was something larger and quieter, something that had been held under significant pressure for a long time and was now being carefully released. Mar, he said, yes, I would very much like this to stop being an arrangement. She looked at him. She felt the terror and the warmth and the particular ache of wanting something this specific after 3 years of wanting nothing but survival. She felt all of it clearly, without flinching from any of it. So would I, she said. They sat in the front room for another 2 hours that evening and talked in the way they had been slowly working up to for months, not around things, not alongside things, but directly at them. He told of its windows were dark. He told her things about Rosalie he hadn't told anyone, not because he wanted to explain her away, but because she deserved to exist in the conversation rather than always being the silence around which everything else moved. He talked about how Rosalie had laughed and how she'd argued fiercely about everything. She had opinions about cattle management and winter, preserve quantities, and the best route to Red Hollow, and she was right about half of them, and wrong about half, and never once conceded either, without evidence, and how the house had not known what to do with the quiet after. Mara told him about Caleb, who was a gentle man and a steady one, not dramatic, not exciting in the way that some people found necessary in a husband, but the kind of person who made everything around him slightly more manageable just by being present. She told him about the 8 months between Caleb's death and Thomas's, which she had never told anyone, the 8 months of just her and a two-year-old boy in a house in Missouri, trying to figure out how to be 2 people when they'd always been 3 or 4. Told him how Thomas had a wooden horse, holding it up, and laughing with his whole body the way small children laugh, and how she had kept the horse partly because of the laughing. Gideon listened. He didn't try to fix anything or reframe anything or find the lesson in it. He just listened and let it be what it was, which was the best thing a person could do with grief that belonged to someone else. When the fire burned low, she said she should probably go up, and he said probably, and she stood up, and he stood up because that was the kind of man he was, and she was at the bottom of the stairs when he said her name again. She turned. He stands in the middle of his front room with the low fire behind him and the Wyoming dark at the windows, and he looked like a man who has made a decision and intends to see it through. I'm going to ask you something, he said, and I want you to take your time with the answer. You don't have to answer tonight. She waited. I'd like you to marry me, he said, not the way we started, not as an arrangement. I mean actually, because I want you here. Because Tessa needs you and I, he paused. Because I need you. And I haven't said that about anyone in 3 years, and I want you to know it's not a thing I say without understanding what it means. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at him, and let herself feel all of it, the terror and the warmth and the grief for what she'd lost and the astonishing persistent fact of what was being offered to her right now in this room by the man who chopped wood when he was angry and built shelves without being asked and talked to his sick daughter about skeptical foals in the dark. I said I needed to take some time to figure something out, she said. I remember, I think I figured it out. He waited. Ask me again in the morning, she said, when we've both slept and the fire isn't making everything look like something it might not be. He looked at her. She could see him weighing this, whether it was a no dressed as a maybe or something else. All right, he said. Good night, Gideon. Good night, Mara. She went upstairs. She lay in the dark in her room with the shelf on the wall, with the watch and the broken horse and the Wyoming winter outside, and she thought, I know what I'm going to say in the morning. I've known it since November. I just needed to be fair to both of us and make sure it was real. It was real. She was certain of it, the way she was certain of very few things, and she was a woman who had learned not to extend certainty beyond what the evidence warranted. So when she felt it, she trusted it. She slept better than she had in a week. In the morning, he was in the kitchen before her, for once, which had never happened in 3 months, and the coffee was already made, and 2 cups were on the table, and he was standing at the stove with his back to the door, doing nothing particular to the stove, just standing near it. She came in, he turned. She sat down at the table. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She looked up at him. Yes, she said. He stood very still for a moment. Then he came and sat across from her, and he reached across the table and put his hand over both her hands, still wrapped around the coffee cup, and she'd come out at his hand and then up at him. And his face had the expression she had no full name for, the one that was large and quiet and had been held under significant pressure. And it was entirely present now, all of it, right there. Yes, she said again, because it was worth saying twice. Tessa found out at breakfast. Not because either of them planned to tell her. At breakfast specifically, the conversation had been between the two of them, and there had been a tacit understanding that they would find the right moment for Tessa, the right words, the right approach. But Tessa came downstairs and saw them at the table with Gideon's hand over Mara's and 2 cups of coffee, and the particular atmosphere of something having happened. Most of its windows were dark, and she stopped 3 steps from the bottom of the stairs and looked at them with those eyes that were considerably older than 7. Did something happen, she asked. Gideon and Mara looked at each other. Come sit down, Gideon said. Tessa came to the table with the careful tread of a child approaching information she has been wanting and is now afraid might not be what she hoped. She sat. She looked at her father, then at Mara, then at their hands, which were still touching. I've asked Mara to marry me, Gideon said. Properly this time, not the way it started. And she said yes. Tessa looked at Mara. You said yes? I said yes, Mara confirmed. The expression that moved across Tessa's face was not the explosion of joy Mara might have anticipated from a child who had been quietly campaigning for this outcome since October. It was quieter than that. It was the expression of someone who has wanted something badly enough and long enough that the getting of it requires a moment of processings before it becomes real. Then Tessovitz got off stool, walked around for the table, and put her arms around Mara's neck and held on with the total commitment of a small child who has decided something is worth holding on to. Mara held her back. She pressed her face into Tessa's hair and breathed and did not cry quite. Over Tessa's head she looked at Gideon, who was watching them with the expression she had no name for, and she thought, This is it. This is the thing I was afraid to want. This was worth the 600 miles and the broken bag and the bruise and the 3 sleepless nights beside a sick child's bed and every careful, slow, terrifying step from October to January. This was worth all of it. The announcement in Red Hollow went the way most things went in Red Hollow, which was thoroughly and without much privacy. Helen Kress heard it first through Mrs. Alderton, who heard it from Emmett, who had told exactly one person at the feed store with the innocent certainty of a 17-year-old that one person was a reasonable number to tell. By the time Gideon and Mara arrived in town the following Saturday for supplies, the information was already ambient. Helen met them outside Harker's Dry Goods with a warmth that was genuine rather than investigative, which told Mara something had shifted in the woman's assessment. I heard the news, Helen said. She looked at Mara, really looked, the way she hadn't entirely done before, as if she was seeing something she'd been trying to see clearly for 3 months and had finally managed. "I'm glad for you both." "Thank you," Mara said. Helen hesitated. "I owe you something of an apology," she said. I was more skeptical than I should have been when you first arrived." "You didn't know me," Marissa said. "Skepticism is reasonable, yes," Helson said. "But there's skepticism and there's—" She stopped. "I made assumptions about what you were based on how you arrived. I don't think those assumptions were fair." Mara looked at her steadily. "What made you change your mind?" Helen considered. "Tessa," she said. "Tessa Voss does not warm to people quickly or foolishly. She's her father's daughter in that way. And she has been a different child this winter than she was last year." She paused. "That kind of difference in a child comes from something real." Mara nodded. She didn't have anything to add to that, because it was accurate and because Helen had arrived at it herself, which was worth more than being told. Inside the store, while Gideon was at the counter, the man behind him, in line a cattle rancher from the east side of the county named Whitmore, whom Mara had seen twice and never spoken to, offered his hand to Gideon and said, loudly enough to carry, "Heard you're getting married again. Good for you. About time you had some help out there." Gideon shook the hand. "Thank you, Hal. She any good with cattle?" Gideon glanced over at Mara, who was examining the bolt fabric with Tessa at her shoulder, pointing out colors with strong opinions. "She's good with most things," he said. "That'll do," Whitmore said, and went back to his list, and that was apparently the full extent of Red Hollow's formal endorsement process. That evening, sitting on the porch in the February cold that was less brutal than January had been, but not yet willing to apologize for anything, Gideon and Mara sat with their coffee and the quiet, and Mara thought about how different the same porch felt from October. In October, she had sat here as a stranger, trying to figure out the shape of a life she hadn't chosen. Now she sat here as a woman who had chosen it, specifically and with full information, and the porch was the same porch, and the coffee was the same temperature, and the Wyoming dark was exactly as dark, but the weight of it was completely different. "I want to tell you something," Gideon said. "You've been saying that a lot lately," Mara said. "I mean it a lot lately." He looked at the dark. "When Tessa was sick, those 3 days." He paused. "I've thought about what Rosalie's illness was like, what I could have done differently, what I should have, and I've been over it enough times that I know there wasn't anything, but I've thought about it anyway, because that's what people do." He stopped. "When Tessa's fever was at its worst and I was sitting there watching and there was nothing I could do that you weren't already doing, I wasn't thinking about Rosalie." Mara waited. "I was thinking about you," he said, "about the fact that you were there, that you knew what to do, that I wasn't alone in it." He looked at his coffee. "I haven't been not alone in a crisis in 3 years. I'd forgotten what it felt like." She thought about what Pike had said he was going under, quietly but going. "I know what it's like to do it alone," she said. "With Thomas. There was nobody, just me and a child and a fever and 4 walls." She paused. "I swore after that if I was ever in that situation again I would know more. Be more prepared, do better." "You did," he said. "Not perfectly." "Well enough," he said. "Better than well enough." They sat in seats in the cold and drank their coffee, and the ranch was quiet around them, and inside the house Tessa was asleep and the fire was burning down, and the shelf on Mara's wall held the watch and the broken horse in the dark, and tomorrow would begin the way tomorrow's at Blackthorn Ranch began, early and full, and requiring more of everyone than yesterday had. "I want to ask you something," Mara said. "Ask the broken horse," she said. "Thomas's toy. I've been keeping it in pieces because I couldn't fix it and couldn't put it down. I was thinking—" She stopped. "I want to ask Emmett if he can try to fit it back together. He's good with his hands. It won't be the same as it was. It'll have the gaps and the repairs showing, but I think I'd rather have it mended, even imperfectly, than keep carrying the pieces." He looked at her. She could see him understanding all the layers of what she was actually saying. "I'll ask him tomorrow," Gideon said. "Thank you." "Mara," she looked at him. "The gaps in the repair," he said slowly, "choosing it with care. That's not the same as broken." She understood him. "No," she said, "it's not." They sat until the cold made staying on the porch an act of stubbornness rather than pleasure, and went inside, and the house closed around them, warm and real and imperfect and entirely theirs. Emmett fixed the horse on a Sunday afternoon in late February, sitting at the kitchen table with wood glue, and a patience that Mara hadn't known he possessed until she watched him apply it. He was not fast about it. He laid the 4 pieces out on a cloth and studied them for a long time before he touched anything, turning them over, checking how the breaks aligned, figuring out the sequence, which piece had to go first, so the others had something to lean against while the glue set. Tessa sat across from him watching, with the focused attention she gave things she considered important. Gideon stood in the doorway for a few minutes, then went out to the barn, which was his version of giving a moment the space it needed. Most of its windows were dark. Mara sat at the far end of the table with her mending and did not hover, because hovering would have made it something different than what it was. When Emmett pressed the last piece into place and held it with both hands, the horse was whole again. Not perfectly, the seams were visible, hairline cracks running along the joins, the left forelegs slightly off angle where the break hadn't been clean. If you looked at it, you could see exactly where it had shattered and exactly where it had been put back together. "It's not invisible," Emmett said, studying his work with the honest assessment of someone who takes pride in doing things right and can see where right fell short of perfect. "It's not supposed to be invisible," Mara said. "It's supposed to hold." Emmett looked at her. He was 17 and not yet practiced at understanding the layers of things adults said, but she watched him almost get there, the edge of it, before he nodded and set the horse gently on the cloth to dry. Tessa leaned forward to look at it. "I think it looks good," she said. "You can see it got hurt. That's not the same as bad." Emmett looked at Tessa with the expression of someone who has just been out-philosophied by a 7-year-old and is not entirely sure how to respond to that. Mara kept her eyes on her mending and thought, "That child is going to be something extraordinary when she grows up." March came in the way. March came in Wyoming, which was not gently and not with any guarantee of what it intended. The snow didn't stop, but it changed character, wetter, heavier, the kind that clung and then melted partially, and then froze again overnight into a treacherous crust that made moving around the ranch an exercise in constant caution. The cattle were restless with the almost spring that kept promising and not delivering. The hands worked long days and came in with the particular exhaustion of men fighting weather that can't make up its mind. But inside the house, something was moving in a different direction than the weather. The wedding was set for April. Not a large affair. Mara had no family to invite and had no interest in ceremony for its own sake, and Gideon's family was scattered and distant and mostly represented by a brother in Montana who sent a letter of congratulations that arrived in mid-March and was read at the supper table to general approval. What they planned was small: the circuit judge who came through Red Hollow every 6 weeks, a few neighbors, the hands. Tessa had opinions about what Mara should wear, which she expressed at length and with complete conviction. "Blue," Tessa said, for the 3rd time in a week, while helping Mara look through the fabric at Harker's. "The same blue as the curtains." "The curtains are dark blue," Mara said. "That's not necessarily a wedding color." "Why not?" "Wedding colors are usually lighter." Tessa picked up a bolt of deep blue cotton and held it up with the authority of a person who considers the matter settled. "It's the color of the sky right before dark," she said. "That's a good color." Mara looked at the fabric. She thought about the curtains she'd hung on a Tuesday in October, the first thing she'd done in the house that made it look like someone lived in it. She thought about how Gideon had looked at the windows that day and said they were fine. "All right," she said, "blue." Tessa's expression was the satisfied expression of someone who has won an argument by being correct. What Mara had not anticipated, what surprised her more than the wedding planning, more than the practical reorganization of their lives, more than the steady deepening of what was between her and Gideon, was the way the grief changed. It didn't disappear. She had not expected it to, and would not have trusted it if it had. Caleb was still Caleb, present in memory with the specific texture of someone real, the way he whistled when he worked, the way he read the same newspaper twice when it was a good one, the way he'd held Thomas up over his head, and Thomas had shrieked with the full-body joy of a child who is briefly flying. Thomas was still Thomas, still 2 years old forever, still laughing at the wooden horse, still the size and weight and warmth of a thing she had carried and lost. But the grief had moved, not backward, not forward sideways, somehow. It had gone from the center of the room to the wall, from the thing everything had to navigate around to the thing that was simply there, known and acknowledged, and not required to be hidden or overcome. It lived in the house alongside the living, and the living made enough noise and warmth and presence that it did not own the silence the way it once had. She noticed this on a Tuesday evening in March when she was cooking supper, and Tessa was at the table drawing, and from upstairs she could hear Gideon moving around in his room, the ordinary sounds of a man washing up after a long day. And she looked at the shelf on the windowsill where she'd moved Thomas's wooden horse after Emmett fixed it, and she felt the grief, clean and specific and real, and she also felt the kitchen around her, and the warmth of the stove, and the sound of Tessa's pencil and Gideon's boots above, and the smell of whatever was in the pot. And both things were true at the same time, and neither one canceled the other. That, she thought, was the thing nobody told you about surviving loss. Not that it got smaller, not that it faded, but that life, if you let it, got big enough around it that you had room to breathe. She had not let it for 3 years. She had kept her life small and her expectations smaller and her wanting down to nothing, because wanting felt like a door that only opened onto rooms where things were taken away. She was done with that. She had decided, somewhere between October and April, that she was done with keeping herself small as a hedge against loss, because loss came anyway. It came for the careful and the careless alike. It came for the people who held everything loosely, and for the ones who gripped so tight their hands went white, and the gripping didn't prevent the loss. It just meant you lost the time you spent gripping. She'd lost enough time. The morning of the wedding, Tessa appeared in Mara's doorway at 6 o'clock with her hair already partially braided, which meant she had been attempting it herself and had gotten about halfway through before the geometry defeated her. "I was trying to do it myself," Tessa said, with the dignity of someone acknowledging a partial failure, "for today, so you wouldn't have to." Mara sat up. She looked at the half-finished braid, which was earnest and lopsided and had incorporated at least unction from the wrong direction. "Come here," she said. Tessa came and sat on the edge of the bed, and Mara worked out the half-braid carefully and started over, and they sat there in the early morning light, with the wedding 2 hours away, not saying very much, because they were people who had learned to be comfortable with each other in the quiet. "Are you nervous?" Tessa asked. "A little," Marissa said. "Not about the right things. What are the wrong things to be nervous about? The ceremony. What people will say. Whether the blue dress is the right color." She divided the hair into 3 clean sections. "None of those things matter. What are the right things to be nervous about?" Mara thought about it. She braided while she thought, her hands moving in the easy rhythm of something done so many times it had become muscle memory. "Doing right by people you love," she said finally. "That's worth being nervous about. Being enough. Being the person someone needs you to be on the days you don't have much left." She tied off the braid. "That's worth taking seriously." Tessa reached up and felt the braid. "You're already that," she said simply. "You already are that person." Mara looked at her. The morning light came through the window and caught Tessa's face, and Mara thought about a 7-year-old in Red Hollow in October who had walked across a dirt street and taken a battered stranger's hand and asked if she could come home with them. That child had understood something that the 2 adults on either side of the arrangement had months spent working out with great caution and difficulty. She had just walked up and taken the hand. "Go get dressed," Mara said, "and don't let your father see you until you're ready. He'll get that look." "What look?" "The look like he's trying not to show that something has made him feel a great deal," Mara said. Tessa grinned a real grin, unguarded, the grin of a child who has been loved well enough to be unself-conscious about happiness. "He gets that look a lot lately," she said. "I know," Mara said. The judge was a man named Caraway, compact and businesslike, who had married people in Red Hollow's small assembly hall a number of times and approached the task with the professional efficiency of someone who respects the weight of a thing without needing to inflate its presentation. There were perhaps 20 people in the room. Helen Kress was there, and Mrs. Alderton, and Whitmore, the cattle rancher from the east side, and a handful of other families who had driven in from the surrounding range. The hands stood together at the back cutter, with his arms crossed and his mouth in the firm line that meant he was feeling something he had no intention of expressing publicly. Pike, with his usual economy of expressions. Emmett in a shirt that had been pressed for the occasion and was already coming untucked on one side. Tessa stood beside Mara. She had insisted on this. It was not traditional, The circuit judge had raised an eyebrow, but nobody in the room had argued with her, possibly because a 7-year-old with Tessa's quality of certainty is not easily argued with. Gideon stood at the front of the room in a dark jacket Mara had not seen before, which told her he had gotten it for the occasion, and she thought, he went and got a jacket. He planned for this. He came into the room with his daughter's hand in his, and then let Tessa go beside Mara, and he looked at Mara in her blue dress, and his face did the thing that Tessa had correctly identified the thing he had. When something affected him beyond his usual management capacity, that quality of a man trying not to show that the moment is larger than his composure. She looked back at him and felt all of it, the terror and the warmth, the grief sitting in its proper place on the wall, the wooden horse on her shelf, Tessa's hand finding hers as Judge Carraway began to speak, and she thought, I walked 600 miles carrying nothing. Look what I found. The words were short. They were supposed to be short. Neither Mara nor Gideon wanted the ceremony drawn out, and Judge Carraway seemed to understand this. Or perhaps he simply understood that the real ceremony had been happening for 6 months, and this was just the part where it became official. When it was done, Tessa clapped. She was the first person to clap, before no one else had quite gathered themselves, and the sound of it sudden and delighted, and entirely her, made the room laugh. And Cutter uncrossed his arms, and Emmett's untucked shirt became a full symbol of the general loosening of formality, and Helen Cress pressed her handkerchief to the corner of her eye in a way she would probably deny later. Gideon looked at Mara. Well, he said. Well, she said. He almost smiled. The full version, not the quarter-inch. It lasted longer than usual. Spring came to Blackthorn Ranch in the way that spring came to Wyoming, not kindly, not all at once, but persistently, pushing against the cold, with the particular stubbornness of something that has been waiting long enough and intends to arrive regardless. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, then the flats, then finally the stubborn north-facing hollows, where it always held longest. And the ground came back the way it always did, dark and wet and smelling of everything starting again. Mara planted the kitchen garden in the last week of April. She had been planning it since February in the gaps, between other things, working out what would grow and what the soil would take and what the household needed most. She did it with a systematic thoroughness that Pike observed from the fence and described to Cutter as the way she does everything, which is like she's already thought of the 3 things that could go wrong and decided how to handle them. Tessa helped. She helped in the way that children help enthusiastically and inaccurately, and with a commentary on every decision was exhausting and occasionally right. She planted 3 things in the wrong rows and had to be redirected twice and dropped the seed packet in the dirt once. And by the end of the afternoon, she was muddy to the elbows and satisfied with her contribution in a way that bore only approximate relationship to what she had actually contributed. I think we make a good team, Tessa said, surveying the garden with the proprietary pride of a part owner. We do, Mara said. I think everything will grow. Some of it will, Mara said. Some of it won't. That's gardening. Tessa considered this. But more will grow than won't. Yes. More will grow than won't. Mara looked at the turned rows, the planted seeds, the good Wyoming soil that had been sitting unworked for too long. That's usually how it goes, if you put the work in. She was not only talking about the garden. Tessa probably knew this. Tessa usually knew. The thing that happened in June surprised Mara, which was itself surprising, because she had thought by June that she had a reasonable handle on what her life at Blackthorn Ranch looked like and what it was likely to contain. What happened was that a family named Duggan from 6 miles north came to the ranch on a Wednesday morning with their youngest child, a boy of 4 named Samuel, who had been running a fever for 2 days and was not improving. The Duggans were not people Mara knew well. She had met the mother. Clara, twice in Red Hollow, exchanged the ordinary pleasantries of neighboring ranching families, but they had heard about Tessa's illness and what Mara had done during it, and Doc Haswell was in Greymount, and the child was sick now, and so they came. Mara took one look at the boy and knew 2 things. It was not the same fever as Tessa's, and it was manageable. She brought him inside and put him in the room that had been hers, before it became hers and Gideon's, and she went to work. Clara Duggan sat in the kitchen and drank coffee with shaking hands and watched Mara move through the sick room with the calm efficiency of someone who has made peace with crises by learning its vocabulary. 3 hours in, When the fever had come down a measurable degree and the boy was resting, Clara looked at Mara across the kitchen table and said, "How do you know what to do?" Mara thought about how to answer that. "I learned it the hard way," she said. "I lost a child before I knew enough. After that, I made it my business to know more." She looked at her coffee. "There's a medical text in Greymount. Doc Haswell lent it to me in February. I've read most of it twice." She paused. "It's not the same as being a doctor, but out here, 40 miles from one, it's something." Clara looked at her. "Could you teach me some of it?" Mara looked at her. The question sat in the kitchen between them, and Mara turned it over and examined what it was asking, and what it was really asking underneath that. "Yes," she said. "I could." Samuel Duggan was well enough to go home in 2 days. He went home with color in his face, and his mother holding him against her side with the grip of a woman who has recently been reminded how much she has to lose. Before Clara left, Mara gave her a written list, the things to watch for, the interventions that helped, when to push for the doctor regardless of distance. Clara folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket like a document of some importance. Which it was. After the Duggans went, Gideon found Mara in the kitchen going through the medical text, cross-referencing something she'd done against what the text said she should have done. He sat across from her and waited until she looked up. "You're checking your work," he said. "I want to know where I was right and where I got lucky," she said. "There's a difference. And the difference matters if there's a next time." He looked at her. "Is that how you think about it? Whether there's a next time?" "There will be a next time," she said. "Out here, 40 miles from a doctor, there will always be a next time. Another child with a fever. Another family who can't get to Greymount fast enough." She closed the text. "I'd rather be useful than wait for it to happen, and wish I'd been more prepared." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "When I was first ranching," he said, "I lost cattle I didn't have to lose. Young, and didn't know what I didn't know. After that, I started reading everything I could find about cattle disease and winter management and herd health." He looked at the medical text. "Most of what I know about ranching I learned because something went wrong, and I decided to make sure it only went wrong that way once." "Yes," Mara said. "Exactly like that." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, briefly, and then went back to his coffee. It was a small gesture and an entirely sufficient one. By the second summer, Mara had been to 4 neighboring families. Word moved through ranching communities, the way water moves through landscape along the paths of least resistance, following the channels that already exist. She had not advertised anything or suggested that to anyone that she was available for this purpose. She had simply been present when people came, and had done what she knew how to do, and the doing had spoken for itself. Doc Haswell rode out to Blackthorn Ranch in August of that second year, and spent a Sunday afternoon at the kitchen table drinking Mara's coffee and talking about medicine in the way of a man who rarely has someone to talk to about it with any depth. He was direct about it. "You have good instincts," he said. "Better than some men I've seen who went through 2 years of formal training. The instincts are one thing. What you've built on top of them is another." He gestured at the medical text, which was now extensively marked and annotated in the margins. "This is the work of someone who takes it seriously." "I take it seriously," Mara said. "I know you do." He looked at her steadily. "I want to loan you a second text, more advanced than this one. And I want to ride out here twice a year and go through cases with you, what you've seen, what you did, what worked, and what you'd change." He paused. "I'm 63 years old, and there are 1,400 square miles of territory in this county that I cannot adequately cover by myself. I've known that for 20 years, and I haven't known what to do about it." He looked at his coffee. "I think I might have found part of the answer." Mara sat with that for a moment. "I'm not a doctor," she said. "No," he said, "but you're something, and something is considerably better than nothing, which is what most of those families have between my visits." She looked at Gideon, who was at the other end of the table with the account books, and had been conspicuously not listening to the conversation in the way that meant he had been listening to all of it. He looked up when she looked at him. He said nothing. He didn't need to. She could read his face well enough by now that the silence was complete communication. "Whatever you decide, I'm with it." "All right," she said to Doc Haswell. "Bring the second text." Tessa turned 8 in September, and then 9, and then 10, and the years at Blackthorn Ranch accreted the way years do in a place that is working not smoothly, not without friction or difficulty or the ordinary disasters of ranching life, but steadily, each year built on the one before it, the way a wall is built from stone you didn't quarry yourself, but laid with your own hands. There was a bad cattle year in 1888 when the price collapsed, and they had to cut and cut and cut again, and Gideon spent 2 months running numbers at the kitchen table with a jaw like a locked door, and Mara sat across from him and went through the accounts with him, and they found a way through it, not without cost, but through. There was a drought the following summer that took the kitchen garden down to almost nothing and required Mara to rethink what she planted and where and how, and she rethought it, and the year after was better. Cutter left in the spring of 1889 to work a ranch closer to his daughter in Colorado, and there was a ceremony of departure around the breakfast table that nobody called a ceremony, but that was nonetheless one. Complete with Cutter making a speech about oatmeal that was ostensibly practical and actually about none of the things he was saying, and Emmett shaking his hand too long, and Pike standing by the door with the look of a man who is keeping his face under strict orders. "You'll be fine," Cutter told Mara the morning he left. He said it the way he said things once, plainly, intending for it to carry. "I know," she said, "so will you." He looked at her for a moment with the direct gaze of a man who has been paying attention for 4 years and wants you to know he's seen what he's seen. "You did a good thing here," he said. "Coming here. Staying." He picked up his bag. A lot of people would have gotten back on the stage. A lot of people would have. Mara agreed. "I had help staying." He nodded. He went out. The kitchen felt different for a week after, the way a room feels when something that has been in it long enough to become part of its character is suddenly absent. Then it adjusted, the way rooms do, and became itself again. The second child came in the winter of 1889, a girl, born in the ranch house, with Doc Haswell present this time, which Gideon had insisted on with the quiet ferocity of a man who will negotiate most things, but not this. The birth was not easy. Mara was 32, and it was her first surviving delivery, and it took 14 hours and tested everyone's composure, including the doctor's. And when it was over and the child was alive and breathing and making the particular indignant sound of a baby who has just discovered the world is considerably colder than where she was, Gideon sat in the chair beside the bed and put his face in his hands for a long moment. Mara, who was exhausted beyond a point she had previously considered her limit, watched him. "You all right?" she said. He lifted his face. His eyes were red, which she had never seen before in 4 years of knowing him. "Fine," he said. He stopped, started over. "She's all right." "She's all right," Mara said. He reached out and took Mara's hand, the one not holding the baby, and held it with both of his. He didn't say anything else. She understood everything he meant. They named her Ruth. Tessa, who had been waiting in the hall with Pike for 14 hours and had consumed her weight in anxiety and oatmeal, came in when the door opened and stood at the edge of the bed and looked at her sister with an expression of profound seriousness. "She's very small," Tessa said. "You were this small," Mara said. Tessa looked skeptical. "I was never this small. You were exactly this small." Tessa looked at Ruth with the expression of someone updating her understanding of a situation. Then, carefully, she reached out and touched the baby's hand with one finger, and Ruth's fingers, impossibly small, impossibly complete, closed around it with the reflexive grip of a newborn, and Tessa made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a breath, and was entirely herself. "Hello," Tessa said, very quietly, to her sister. Mara thought about her mother sometimes, in the years that followed. Not the idealized mother of memory, but the real one, a woman from Missouri who had been afraid of most things and had not, as far as Mara could tell, ever decided to stop being afraid, who had kept her life small as a way of managing risk, and had managed the risk successfully, and had also never had anything larger than small. Mara had grown up watching that and had not known, for most of her life, that she was watching a lesson. She understood now what the lesson was. Not the lesson her mother had intended, not caution as wisdom, not smallness as safety, but the other lesson, the one underneath. That fear is not a strategy. That keeping yourself down to the minimum of what you're willing to lose only means you live at the minimum. That the losses come anyway, and what they find when they come is either a life or the space where one could have been. She had lived in that space. For 3 years in Missouri and 600 miles of road, and all the way to the stagecoach stop in Red Hollow, she had been occupying the outline of a life, rather than the life itself. She thought about Tessa walking across a dirt street on a cold October morning and taking her hand. She thought about what would have happened if she'd been so committed to managing her expectations that she couldn't receive what was being offered. She thought about a man who built a shelf without discussion and talked to his sick daughter about skeptical foals in the dark, and said, "You have comprehensively destroyed my plan," like it was the truest compliment he knew how to pay. You could protect yourself straight past everything worth having. She had nearly done it. She had gotten on a stagecoach to Wyoming with nothing left, and she had nearly talked herself into getting back on one going east. And if she had, she would have been safe, and she would have been alone. Most of its windows were dark, and she would have called the aloneness being careful, and she would have believed it. She was glad she had kept walking. Tessa grew up in the way that children grow up in places that expect something of them not fast, not easily, but with roots that went down far enough that the growing was real. She was 12 when she started helping Mara with the neighboring families in earnest, carrying the bag, learning to read the signs. Mara read. She was 14 when she told Mara she wanted to be a doctor, in the flat certain voice of a person reporting a decision rather than asking a question. Mara looked at her. She thought about Doc Haswell, saying there were 1,400 square miles of territory he couldn't adequately cover by himself. She thought about Clara Duggan folding a written list into her coat pocket like a document of importance. "Then you'll be a doctor," Mara said. Tessa looked at her steadily. "You think it's possible. I think it will be hard," Mara said. "I think some people will tell you it isn't possible, and some of those people will have authority, and you'll have to work around them or through them, and none of it will be simple." She looked at her stepdaughter, who had her father's eyes and her own particular stubbornness. "But I don't think possible is the question. I think possible is settled. The question is how much you're willing to do for it." Tessa thought about this. "A lot," she said. "Yes," Mara said. "I thought you'd say that." The wedding drawing stayed on the wall. Tessa never took it down, and neither did Gideon, and Mara never suggested they should. By 1891 it had been there, so long the paper had gone soft, and the crayon colors had faded to ghosts of themselves. The horse barely visible, the 3 original figures pale, the 4th figure in red nearly gone except for the arms that extended slightly outward, tentative and reaching. Mara looked at it sometimes. She thought about the October morning when she had first seen it, before she knew Tessa had added to it, before she understood what the addition meant. She thought about standing in front of it with Gideon that first evening, and both of them looking at the small red figure that a child had quietly placed into a picture of her family. The figure was fading now, but the original 3 remained, and beside them the red outline, and around the whole thing the accumulated evidence of the years, the curtains Mara had hung on a Tuesday, the shelf Gideon had built without being asked, the annotated medical texts on the kitchen shelf, Ruth's drawings pinned alongside Tessa's, the marks on the doorframe where they measured the children's heights each spring. A house full of evidence that people had lived here, were living here, intended to keep living here. The wooden horse sat on the shelf in Mara's room, in the room that was Mara and Gideon's room, where it had been since Emmett put it back together on a Sunday afternoon in February with wood glue and patience. The seams were visible. The left foreleg was slightly off angle. If you looked at it, you could see exactly where it had shattered and exactly where it had been repaired. It held. That was what mattered. It held. There is a thing that grief does to people that nobody warns you about, which is that it can become the story you tell yourself about who you are. The person who lost, the person to whom things were taken, the person traveling with empty hands. It can become so central to how you understand yourself that the idea of setting it down feels like setting yourself down. Like if you stop grieving, you stop being the person who loved the ones you lost. Mara had believed this. She had believed it with the conviction of someone for whom the belief had been doing real work, keeping her together in the years when nothing else would. She had walked 600 miles, carrying that belief in a broken bag along with a pocket watch and a shattered toy horse, and she had arrived in Wyoming fully prepared to remain defined by what had been taken from her. What she had found instead was something she had not known how to want, because she had not known it was possible that the grief and the living could coexist. That loving Thomas did not prevent her from loving Tessa. That remembering Caleb did not prevent her from loving Gideon. That the losses were real and permanent and did not require forgetting. And that life stubborn, inconvenient, demanding, full of children who braided their own hair incorrectly, and cattle prices that collapsed, and kitchen gardens that needed starting over life, did not wait for you to finish grieving before it offered you something. It just kept offering. You had to be paying attention to receive it. She had almost not been paying attention. She had been so busy managing her expectations that she'd nearly walked past the child, extending her hand on a dirt street in October. Sometimes she thought about that. Sometimes she thought about it with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite grief, but lived in the same territory as both the feeling of a person who has been given something they nearly refused and knows it. The ranch was quiet in the evenings now, the particular quiet of a place that has noise in it all day and settles into itself after supper, with the satisfaction of work done. Gideon at the table with his account books. Ruth asleep upstairs, 8 years old and deeply committed to sleep as an activity. Tess away at school in Laramie now, her letters arriving every 2 weeks, each one longer than the last, full of the specificity of a person who has found her direction and is moving in it with everything she has. Outside Wyoming in October. 6 years from the day a stagecoach driver had thrown a broken bag into a road and driven away from a woman he'd considered someone else's problem. Mara Voss's not Ellsworth anymore, not the widow from Missouri, not the woman who arrived with nothing, sat in her kitchen with her coffee and the fire and the quiet, and she felt the full weight of her life, which was considerable, and she did not try to put any of it down. She had been carrying things all her life. She had learned finally the difference between the weight that crushes you and the weight that means you have something worth holding. She held it, she held all of it. And outside, the Wyoming dark came down over Blackthorn Ranch the way it always did, complete, and cold and utterly indifferent to the small warm light in the kitchen window, and the small warm light held anyway the way it always had, the way it always would.